Well, okay, let's go ahead and get started today. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone for spending your time and coming and listening to me learn about developing custom visuals for Power BI. One quick note before we jump into the topics at hand, and that is at Critical Path, we have a brand new course which is focused not just on Power BI and the platform, but the developer aspect of it. And a lot of the content we're going to cover today is going to be inside this course as well. So while we already had a Power BI bootcamp, now we have one which kind of focuses on writing code with Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code. Okay, I'll talk a little bit more about that at the very end, but let's go ahead and get started with the program. So we're going to have a quick overview of Power BI visuals and then importing custom visuals that other developers have made. Now, these first two sections I'll hurry through so we can spend the majority of our time on the last two sections, which is where the meat of this webinar is. So we're going to talk about programming using TypeScript instead of JavaScript, which is going to be very important to creating custom visuals, and also programming with the D3.js library. And we're going to basically look at that as two new learning curves before we even hit creating custom visuals for Power BI. And then in the last section, we're going to cover the tools that you use to develop custom visuals for Power BI. And for many of us with a traditional Visual Studio background, there's this new twist. And that is that Microsoft's real big on cross-platform developer tools. So when you use what Microsoft recommends, you're going to be installing node.js. You're going to be using Node Package Manager. You're going to be using Visual Studio Code instead of Visual Studio 2015. So that's what we're going to look at the last section of, how to make that shift over to this new cross-platform tool set and how to get up and going developing custom visuals. Okay, now there's a bunch of visuals that are built in to Power BI. For instance, if we go ahead and we crank up Power BI Desktop, let's say that I'm not a developer, but I'm a data analyst that's been doing a lot of work with the Power BI framework. Okay, so now what we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and open a particular project inside there. And so I'm going to go to this particular project. I'm going to find my PBIVIZ file. And the idea is that developers have this set of visuals that they're able to use. It's a lot like control development that we've had for the last 10 or 15 years, in the fact that certain developers create these little black boxes, and then the consumers are able to instantiate instances of them. Okay, now if you look at the built-in set of controls, we have things like the column chart, we have bar charts, we have 100% stacked column charts. Did I mention I was going to go through this first section very fast? There's built-in line charts. There's the ability to start adding trend lines when you have a particular line chart. There's waterfall charts. There's scatter charts. There's gauge charts. So there's a pretty good wealth of different charts. And what you see now is that as you're working with Power BI Desktop, let's go back here for a second and notice that, if you don't have all the different mapping visualizations available, if I go down to Options, and then I go down to the preview features, what you're going to find is that there's certain visuals that are in preview, and they don't show up unless you basically enable that particular preview feature. Okay, now one really nice part about the Power BI platform for developers is that the whole idea of a visual, Microsoft created as an extensible, open-ended proposition. Now, who's Power BI's big competition? It's Tableau. Here's a huge advantage that Microsoft has over Tableau if you kind of look out over the next 5 or 10 years. And that is any developer can basically create a custom visual to extend the platform. And Microsoft is very proactive at giving us the tools. In Tableau, another visualization is not going to show up until someone on the team basically creates it and builds it into the product or service. Okay. Now, there is a custom visuals gallery. So if I go to this particular link, let's go to this particular link and just kind of look at the consumer side of working with custom visuals. So, let's say that I become disenchanted with the set of visuals that come out of the box in Power BI and Power BI Desktop. So I go down here and start looking at some things, and what I find is, hey, there's a thing called the hierarchy slicer. I look at the built-in controls, and let's say that I create a new particular page, and I want to be able to slice and dice by product, and I have this wonderful product category. But there's nothing that's built in other than a one-dimensional slicer. So if I create that slicer, I could create it, based on category or the child subcategory, but what I really want to do is kind of have something that gives me the ability to express a hierarchy inside of a filtering slicer visual. So we're going to come back here, and I'm going to go ahead and click, and I want to download a visual. I have to go through and agree, and what you're going to see is the visual gets downloaded, and it's downloaded as a PBIVIZ file. So we'll go ahead and we'll save that. So once we have saved that, let's go ahead and take this particular file, and let me go back and just kind of take a look at what's inside here. So when you have a distributable that is a custom visual, it's inside of this PBIVIZ format, which is really just a zip archive. Let me rename the file so it has a zip extension. Now I can open it up and kind of see what's inside. So I'm going to go ahead and grab these inside. Let's go back here. Let's go ahead and add a new folder, and we'll have this be the curious folder. And inside, you can see that there's a package.json file, and then there are all the little tidbits, that make this thing come to life. Now, when I want to use that, let's go back here, and what you'll see is that both within Power BI Desktop, and if you're up in the browser and you're editing a report in the Power BI service, I can basically say I want to import a custom visual. Okay, once I import that custom visual, and now I've kind of messed myself up because I'm going to have to go back and give this back to the regular extension. Okay, but now that we do that, let's go back and take a look at importing. And so the idea is we can go ahead and import it, and now we have that visual that's inside here. And now I can go ahead and add that particular visual inside. And now instead of a single field, we're going to go ahead and we're going to pick a custom visual inside. Let me go ahead and make it a little bit easier to see. But what you'll see is that now we can start drilling down and looking at things inside. And just to give you a quick picture, let's say that we want to see something, as simple as product. And I take that back. Let's go to customers, and we'll take customer state, and we'll look at sales revenue per state inside there. But what we can see here, is by using this particular slicer, some developer, has created some type of a widget that I couldn't get by any other means. Okay, so what we've seen so far is that there's a custom visual gallery. Here's just a couple examples of visuals that you can pull out of the gallery. Things like histograms. There's a tornado chart. There's a really neat one called spark lines, which gives you basically trend or the line, but nothing else. So it's easy to put many of those together. And the hierarchy slicer. Okay. So now that we've kind of rushed through the first two sections, I wanted to kind of set the, the correct background for custom visual development. And that is that none of the out-of-the-box visuals are really cutting it for me. I can't find a custom visual in the gallery, so we basically want to start creating visuals ourselves. Now, the first thing that we're going to look at is the main library that we use to create graphs and charts, which is the d3.js library. Also, what's very important is working with TypeScript. And I'm assuming that there are many of you who either are just starting to work with TypeScript or haven't basically jumped in and transitioned from programming in JavaScript to begin programming in TypeScript. Okay, now what we want to look at is some sample code that I'm going to show in a second. And there is sample code available for everything that I'm going to show you in this webinar. And also there's a slide deck inside here as well. Okay, now if I go here, turns out that that is the wrong place. I'm sorry I have my slides a little bit mixed up, but we're going to go to GitHub and we're going to go to custom visuals for Power BI. So I apologize. In real time, let me go ahead and fix this particular slide with one more apology there. So basically, the place that you're going to get this is right here, and it basically is github.com, critical path training, custom visuals for Power BI. Okay, now when you go here, what you're going to see is that there is a Visual Studio project, Learning D3 with TypeScript, that I'm about to walk through. And then there is a set of custom visual sample projects inside here that I'm going to look through as well. Okay, and then here's the slide deck if you want that. Now, the first thing that we have to do as we start working through this is to come to terms with TypeScript. So let's say that I go to Visual Studio. And let's go ahead and we're going to create a new simple web application. And so, let's say I'll just call this hello TypeScript. And as I create this particular project, let's go ahead and kind of see how we would build something with TypeScript. And so we'll start by just creating an empty project right here. It's got absolutely nothing inside of it. Okay, so now what I'd like to do is, let's say we add a particular HTML page, and that's going to be index.html, and then we're going to add some TypeScript code. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and add a new folder, and so all the code that I'm going to be creating is going to go inside of an app folder. Now, the whole idea of TypeScript, let's go ahead and create our first TypeScript file. We'll go ahead and create this TypeScript file inside here, and this is just going to be called app.ts. And as you start working with Visual Studio, it basically says that it will add TypeScript support. And the idea is that every time you take this particular project and run it, it will convert that app.ts file into an app.js file. So one of the things that you're going to need to do is take the TS file, just like you would with a JavaScript file, and drag it over here. In fact, Visual Studio is smart enough to say it can't really add a script link to a TS file. It adds it to the JS file, which is going to be built automatically. Now, I want to start writing some code inside here. And so maybe the first thing that I'm going to do is add two different libraries. So I'm going to go to the project and say manage NuGet packages. Also, one of the things that I want to show you is right now I'm using the NuGet package manager and I'm using Visual Studio. Later, when we start using Visual Studio Code and we're using an environment based on node.js, we're going to use the Node package manager to accomplish the same thing. So one of the reasons I want to come up here is just to kind of show you, the difference. But let's say that we, want to work with jQuery. That's great. Okay. And then the second thing is there's this library, which is the D3 library. So we'll go ahead and install those. But after I install those, you're still not going to get IntelliSense. So what you need are these special files, which are known as the typings file or the typed definition files. So here is the D3 typed definition file. Let's go ahead and choose install. And I'm going to install that inside there. So you can see that, here are the libraries, but now you have these typings files. And the idea is it's a layer on top of a JavaScript library so that when you write TypeScript code, it can be compiled, in a strongly typed fashion against that, and also it's able to give us IntelliSense. Okay, and also, if I'm using jQuery, which you might or might not, you can also get the jQuery typings files as well. And so the idea is once you have done that, now when we start writing code and I start saying D3 dot, we're going to start getting basically the IntelliSense inside there. Okay, so now that I've created that starter project, I'm going to go ahead and open something that gives you a lot more examples of starting to work with the D3 library. Okay, so what I have here is I have a simple app.ts file, and then we have a visuals.ts file. Now inside of this, remember this is an application that you can go and download and start doing whatever you want with it. And we have a whole bunch of different visuals inside there. One of the nice things about working with this, give me 1 second to collapse all these definitions. Somehow this doesn't want to work for me. Collapse to definitions. Okay. Anyway, somehow Visual Studio's not. But let's look at these just one at a time inside here. So what I wanted to do is just kind of show a simple example of using TypeScript to generate a class. Now here, we're not involving Power BI, but I wanted to kind of create a design that's somewhat like the environment that your custom visuals be injected into. So we're going to create this method called create, and the idea is that some host will create an instance and basically pass you a variable so you can hold on to something. And here we're using just jQuery in the first example. We're not using D3 yet. Well, then you're going to have the init method inside here. Now let's go ahead and run the code. And what you're going to see here is, I tried to make this very easy to run and to work with. So the idea is you just click on this button and all of a sudden you get your first visual. Now, the first thing that you have to come to terms with is that you have no idea how much real estate your visual will get. So generally we create things. Let's go ahead and take this window and start reshaping it. And so, what you can see here is that, as you keep moving the window, you get update executions for a particular method. Now here, first thing we'll do in create is we will basically call init. Inside of init, we're going to create just a jQuery div, put some things inside there. We're going to then take that particular div, we're going to append it to the container. Okay, and then we're going to go ahead and call update. Let's see what update does here. So with update, at first we're just going to use jQuery, and we're going to figure out what the width of the viewport is. And the idea there is you're trying to figure out what the width and height is of your basically plotting surface. And so in our case right here, we're going to basically create a JavaScript or TypeScript object known as the viewport, and we're just basically going to use that to resize things inside. Okay, now that was our first example. One little extra thing that I want to show here is if I make a change here, let's say that I change this to hello webinar, and I hit save, Control S, and I come back and I refresh, and now what I want to be able to do here, why is that text, and okay, 1 second. Let me try that one more time. Maybe I was having a compile error or something inside there. Okay. One more second for me to figure out why that wasn't working correctly. Okay, well, let's not worry about that. What I want to do now is let's move on. So what I wanted to do is give you the first example, inside of just using jQuery. So now we're going to move ahead and use the D3 library. So here, once again, the sample application is going to call the create method. The create method passes you, basically a string that has something like a CSS reference that you can use in jQuery, # my ID. And the idea is that you're able to take that and you're able to say d3.select and basically create a selection around the HTML element that you want to push something inside. So now when we use the D3 library, we use SVGs, or scalable vector graphics. And so there is this root element, which is the SVG element. So we'll go ahead and we'll create that, and we'll put that right at x = 0, y = 0. Well, the next thing we want to do is create an ellipse. Now note that in this init method, that's not generally where we do the drawing. We do the drawing in the update method. So in init, we're basically going to create a bunch of D3 objects. one being the SVG, the second one being an ellipse, and the next one being a text element. And then what we're going to do here in the update method is somewhat similar. Let's go ahead and look at this code right here. And the idea, is that we can now go ahead and move this around inside here. And as I move this around, my vector is just basically, my vector graphics are just kind of scaling. Okay. So before we get to data or any of the complicated parts, just knowing how to draw in terms of the D3 library, gets to be an important thing. Here you can also see that if I want the text to be able to fit inside, the text has to get bigger and smaller as well. Notice that if I go down here, the text gets larger, and then at some point the text gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So being able to scale things so that they can get either really big or really small and look good, is kind of the art of getting really good with the D3 library. Now, one more thing that I want to look at, and that is I want to basically hook into the Windows resize event. Now, it would be possible for you to do something that looks like this. I could just call this.update. The problem with calling this.update is that if you make that particular call inside there, it'll execute update, but the this pointer will be a Windows object. It will not be the object which is your custom visual. So there's this trick inside of TypeScript. And what you do is you kind of create an anonymous method. It's a lot like C# if you've used that, but the idea is you define a parameter list. In our case, the parameter list is empty. Then we use the lambda operator, and then we basically have a function body inside here. And the idea is that this executes the method, but it retains the this pointer. So when I come back and I say this.svg, it doesn't tell me that this doesn't have the SVG inside there. Okay, so we'll be using that, quite a bit. Now, as we keep going through here, let's look at example 3. Now, in example 3, what I decided to do, because I wanted to show a couple other examples, is just start creating some type of a infrastructure for running these type of visuals. So let's say that inside of TypeScript, I just create a simple interface called iViewport. And so all it does, it has the width and height. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create a custom visual base. And so the idea is that it can have a container, which is going to be a D3 selection. And note that when you create a D3 selection, TypeScript uses generics. So if you put type equals any, you can put anything inside there. You can strongly type that to a certain type of D3 element, such as an SVG text or SVG ellipse. Okay, now once I've got this, I can basically have kind of a reusable implementation of create, calling the different methods inside there. Great. I can have other classes that inherit from this, and they don't have to provide all that code that automatically calls the update method passing the this pointer. In fact, now I can just create other classes that just override init and update. Okay, so now you've seen that. Let's see our first example. So now we're going to have viz03 extends custom base. And so it's going to add in an SVG, an ellipse, and a text element. And then the pattern is the first method creates the objects but doesn't complete the actual rendering. It does the one-time operations, after the visual gets instantiated, and then update is the thing that's called every time there is a screen resize. So here, what we're going to do is we're going to create the ellipse and the text object inside. And while this example, is very much like the first example, a lot of the implementation details have been pushed to a reusable base class. Okay, that's great. Let's keep going. Now, the next thing we're going to look at is Visual 4. We're going to start using data. So what we're going to do is take a look at this. I wanted just to use D3 and create a set of bars. And one of the things that we want to do is be able to move the bars around and have them automatically resize. Now at first, we're just going to hard code a simple array of integers inside there. Okay, now we'll create an SVG. We'll create a rectangle. We'll have some padding. Now in our case right here, we're going to do most of the work in the update method. In the init, we're just going to create the SVG. But now what we're going to do is we're going to take the SVG, and every time there is an update method called, we're going to readjust the size of the SVG to basically be the same size as the viewport. I'm also going to create a plot. Think of the viewport being the entire screen, and then if you want to have some padding to the left, right, above, and below, we can create a plot. So the idea here is the plot has, an X offset, a Y offset, a width, and height. Okay, the next thing is we're going to take the data set, figure out how long the data set is, and then I have to do things like create the scale factor for both X and Y. And the idea is that how tall should this thing be? Well, if we look at our data set and we find the maximum value, the idea is that we want that thing to hit the top. And so the actual values don't change, but as you go up and down and make things shorter or wider, you need things to expand, so you need some type of a scale factor. Okay, now in this case right here, here's one of the big magic parts about D3. You have this data set. So you'll call data, and you'll pass a data set, and then you'll say data.enter. And then you're adding a rectangle, but you're adding a rectangle for each element inside of this data set. And so what we're able to do inside there is create a rectangle for each thing inside, and then here's the X, here's the Y. Now, while you could do something, as simple as hard coding in a particular value here, what gets to be more common is for you to add a particular function. So when you add a function, there is going to be a data value, and there's going to be the index, and you can go ahead and create the implementation inside here. Now let's get back to how it looked. So the idea is that now we're just going to be able to take the plot and find the offset, and same thing here, but now what we're able to do is reset the bar width, and then we're going to use the scale factor. At the very end here, I basically am just doing an attribute fill with a teal. But the idea here is that every time we resize the screen, update is being called, and I'm able to redraw that set of bars inside there. Okay, now let's go to number 5. Now we want to add in some labels. And so what you're going to see here with number 5 is that in addition to adding in those particular bars, so here we're taking the SVG file and we're saying select all rectangles like before. Except now we're going to also add in a text element. And so one of the things that I wanted to show here, is basically when I'm adding in the text element and it's redrawing every time there's a refresh, well, maybe I want to do something such as, what is going to be the text? So with text, you can provide a function. And so, while you could, have this syntax function and have it, looking like that inside there, what you might find is that if you use this syntax, remember this is the TypeScript way to create that anonymous function inside there. But then also when you use this, if that function needs a this reference back to your object, you're going to have that as well. Okay, so here we're going to return the value of D with the $sign. You can also see there's some code as this gets wider and bigger. We're able to make the text bigger. We're able to make the text smaller inside. Okay. Now, let's keep going. So I have some time at the end to talk about working within Power BI. In number 6, we're going to add in this particular element when we're creating something inside here, we're going to add accesses in. Okay, so here, as we go from 5 to 6, all of a sudden, we're going to add in this particular axis. And so here's just an example of creating an access. Let me go back up here, kind of show you where the access is being created. And there's actually a couple things that this demo is going to bring in. In order to work with access ease, you also need to work with scales. Now, in the previous example, I just had some code to figure out, what I need to multiply to get the height of bars and to get the font size inside. But the D3 library comes with a scale. And the idea is you put your start domain and stop domain inside there. So the domain is the range of the actual values. So what we're going to do is we're going to set the domain start to be the maximum value. You might think it should be domain stop. One of the strange things about working with D3 is that as you move down, the Y values get bigger. So what you have to do is kind of reverse your logic inside there. And basically the larger something is, the more down it is. So when we're working with a domain, quite often the start is the maximum value and the stop is the minimum value inside there. Now, when you create a scale, you have a range and you have a domain. While the domain is just the domain of values, the range is basically the pixels that you have on your screen to work with. And so the idea is we go ahead and we've created a scale. Okay, once we've created a scale, let's go down here a little bit further to kind of see once we have that scale, we're going to create the x-axis and give it a scale and basically say left and how many ticks inside there. Now also, when you create axes, quite often you use a translate call. And the idea is when you say translate, you're able to give it an X and a Y offset. Okay, so ultimately you're calling access and you're basically just kind of doing some real estate management to make sure that the access has enough to draw inside there. Okay, going just a little bit further, if we go to 7, what 7 is going to do is just add in this idea of events. So here, we're going to create the rectangles. But as we create these particular rectangles, what I'd like to do is have some type of behavior inside. Now, I'm not doing much behavior here, but what I want you to see is how easy it is to add the behaviors inside there. As you're creating these rectangles, you're going to put a mouse over event, and as someone comes in and basically wants to fill it with red, and then on a mouse out, we'll change it back to teal. Now, one key aspect is that you cannot use this syntax that I've been telling you about how wonderful it is. The problem with this is that if you do that, the this reference is no longer that SVG element. It's now your custom visual. So when you're dealing with that, we kind of leave the old syntax so that the this reference, is really this particular object that you're hovering over. And so what do we use these for? Well, for mouse over, that's where you would basically add a tooltip. You'd basically pop up some type of text and give them more information about that element. You can handle click events if you want to do something like have your visual support Power BI highlighting. Okay, and now if we go to the very last example that I'm going to show here, the very last example that I'm going to show, which is number 8, all of a sudden stops using a built-in hard-coded array, but instead it's going to go get some data, and D3 has a whole bunch of library functions. So if you want to get data from a CSV file or a whole bunch of other data sources, you're able to pull this in. So here's some code that's going to pull data in from this data1.csv file. It then is able to get the data, bring it back, call refresh, and basically get to the same point inside there. Okay, so what I wanted to do in that first section, is just kind of go through, the idea of being able to work with the D3 library and getting comfortable with TypeScript. Okay, so now the next thing that we're going to do is move ahead and talk about how we use the Power BI developer tools that were created by Microsoft. Now, if you're like me and you're kind of the traditional Visual Studio developer, over the last 2 years, you might have noticed that at every single conference, the Microsoft dev folks now are really kind of motivated by their management to do everything on Macs and not use Windows machines, and to start using, you know, all the tools that other developers use but we never have. So there's this mandate from on high that developer teams have to create, you know, development tools that are cross-platform. So if it only works with Visual Studio, you know, that's a problem. So what you'll see is that new frameworks, like the SharePoint framework and like the one for Power BI visuals, are based on top of node.js. So you're going to have to install node.js. As you install node.js, that installs a very important thing called the Node Package Manager, and that is going to basically replace the NuGet Manager. Now, you're also able to work with Visual Studio, but when you start working with this cross-platform node.js environment, you might find that Visual Studio Code, you know, is a better alternative. We're going to have to also install this little utility called PBIVIZ. Okay, now I've already gone through the important steps of installation. You know, so basically you have to install Node.js. Note that when you install Node.js, it installs the Node Package Manager. So Node.js, the runtime is used to start a project so you have a debugging environment. The Node npm Package Manager is what allows you to download code inside there. Now, you can also install Visual Studio Code. It's much lighter weight than Visual Studio. You can download and install this from across the internet in, you know, under a minute. It's that quick. And the idea is that when you install it, you can open up any single folder. You know, it's a folder-based approach to writing software rather than Visual Studio, which is a project-based approach. So once you install Visual Studio Code, that's great. Now, the next thing that you have to do is you have to install the Power BI Visual CLI, stands for Command Line Interface. So basically, it is a command line driven tool called PBIVIZ.exe that you basically install from the Node.js command prompt, and you also utilize it from the Node.js command prompt. Now, if I go ahead and I bring up the Node.js command prompt, what I'm going to do now is let's go ahead and, you know, move over to our demos folder inside here. Now, what you'll see here is that you've got to run npm install /g Power BI Visual Tools, and that's going to download things, including PBIVIZ. Now, I've already installed this, so if I go ahead and run this, you know, what we can see is that there's a little splash screen inside there, and then here are the different commands that we're going to start using. Okay, now, once you've installed that, you're going to start using commands like new and start and package. Now, I want to create a new particular project. So let's go ahead and see how that's going to work. Before I do that, you know, let's go back and take a look at this one particular directory here. Okay, great. And now inside of this command prompt, what we're going to do is I'm going to basically run the PBIVIZ new, and here's a new project. Let's just call it Thursday. And I'll even take the effort to spell Thursday correctly. We'll go ahead and we create that new visual. And so what you can see, what this tool does is it creates this new particular directory. Now, what's kind of neat is once you have created this visual, I'm now going to switch over to that particular visual or switch over to its folder. Okay. Let's say I want to use Visual Studio Code. You can start Visual Studio Code just by typing code in the command line, and then if you type a dot, you're basically saying open code and open the current folder. So we'll go ahead, we'll do that, and so now it opens Visual Studio Code, and so now I can look inside there and we can start seeing, you know, what this project looks like. Okay, now let me go through some of the slides. Once we've got things up and running, we have to know the different files and different folders. So there's something called the gitignore file. So if there's a certain file type, such as debugging files and other things, and you don't want them to be pushed into GitHub, you can use that. Now, the things we care about is the capabilities.json file, which we're going to see. There is the PBIVIZ file. there's the package.json file, which generally you don't have to touch because they create it, and it's only when you have a package that's going to be used by others that you really care about it. But the files that I've underlined right here, minus the package.json, are the ones that we care about. For instance, if I go back here and we find the PBIVIZ JSON file and we open that up, here's where you do things like you put your name, things like that inside there. If I look into source, there's visual.ts, and so basically here is the starting point for creating one of these particular visuals. And what you see is that when you create this new project, it basically creates a module called Power BI extensibility.visual. And so one nice thing about being inside of that module is it automatically taps you into what they have in the underscore API. So they have the Power BI visuals, think of it as the visual Power BI object model that you can program against inside of TypeScript. Okay, for things like iVisual, the interface that all visuals have to implement, is defined, inside of the Power BI's visual API. Okay, now let's say that I want to start using D3 inside here. I come here and I say D3, and where is my IntelliSense? It's not there. So one of the things that we're going to have to do, let me go through here a little bit fuller, is basically find out how we're going to add these things inside there. Now, let me go ahead and grab this here. And the idea here is that we need to add some typings inside. So first thing we have to do is you have to install through Node Package Manager global support for working with typings to begin with. Okay, so we're going to go ahead, we're going to add that inside. That's step one. You can see it basically, it's running inside there. It's going to take a couple more seconds. It's basically adding things, into a shared directory across all my projects so that when I'm working with this tool, I can use that. Okay, here's a whole bunch of output. Let's go ahead and ignore that. But now, once I have that support, I can now start adding typing support into my individual projects. Now, let's do a before and after. I go to my project and I kind of look at these top level folders. Okay, great. Let's now go back and run this command inside here. And after I run this, I come back and there is a new typings folder. Inside of the typings folder, there is this top level index.ts. And the idea is once you add these, there is the D3 index.ts. Now you don't have to reference the individual index.d.ts files. There is a top level one, and every time you add typings in that fashion, they update this. Now, what you'll find is I still don't have IntelliSense yet. I'll come back here. So what you have to do is you have to open this special file, which is called tsconfig. It's the TypeScript configuration file. And the idea is that here, I'll say typings / index.d.ts, and we'll save our work inside there. And so we point to this top level index.d.ts file. And once I've done that, now we should be able to come back here, D3, and now we're able to move around and do things inside there. Okay, so now you've seen that. Let's go ahead, and take a look at a project that has enough code to kind of do hello world. So what I'm going to do is let's go ahead and open a different folder. So one of the samples that I gave you inside is one which is called my first project. Let's go ahead and open that. Remember, with Visual Studio Code, you're not looking for an SLN file. You're just opening a folder. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and open this inside. Once this opens, here is a visual that kind of does the hello world like I did earlier just before we got into Power BI. So this will kind of give me some code, so now we can go ahead and test the debugger. So now, how do we actually do debugging? So let's go back to the node.js command prompt. I'm now going to switch over into that directory of my first project, and then we're going to use PBIVIZ, and we're going to run this thing called the start command. And the idea is that just starts up a node.js project. Also, if I have some errors inside here, it's going to tell me about what those errors are. I was not expecting that inside there. Seems like I just ran this and it ran fine. Let me, well, okay, so I have one problem. So let me go ahead and switch over to a different project. But what I'm trying to show is that whenever you run this particular start command, once again, let's go ahead and run PBI start. It's going to take your code inside there, and okay, I'm getting this with everything now. This is not good. Let me go ahead and close some things down. Oh, I might have had a problem because Visual Studio Debugger is still running. But getting this working is pretty key to my demo here. So let me close some. Oh, and the other problem is that I already had something listening on another port. I had a second instance of this going. Okay, forgive me. This was all user error. So let's try this one more time. Okay, so we're going to bring up the node.js command prompt, and we'll switch over to that particular project. And that project was my first project. And now we'll go ahead and run that same command inside there. So PBIVIZ start. And so as you run this right here, what happens is it basically starts a Node.js web server running on port 8080. And the idea is that the Power BI team figured out how we can actually have a debugging environment. Okay, and that's done by going to the Power BI service. So we'll say app.powerbi.com. Once we get here, and we are going to log in, and then we're just going to go to any old report. Now, I have a report that I've been using. I just call it Custom Visual Testing. And we're going to go into Report Edit Mode. Now, once I get into Report Edit Mode, you're going to want to see this little visual called the Developer Visual. Now, first thing is, if you don't see that, and you won't by default, you go to Settings. Under Settings, under Developer, well, now you have the Enable Developer Visual. And the idea is that when you use this, and that's checked off, you're just going to see this little thing inside there. Okay, so now the idea is that you're having a visual inside. Now, at the same time, let's say I go back to that particular project here and kind of show you how you iterate through things. So I'll go back to my first project. We'll open with Visual Studio Code. And once I open this and we take a look at this thing inside there, we have something like hello custom visuals. So now what I'm going to do is hello, and I'll say hello webinar. I'll hit the save key. And as I hit the save key, one of the things that you'll notice is that that Node.js web server project detected that one of my files had changed, and it basically rebuilt the project. If I have any problems, inside of my code, let's go back here and, instead of D3, we'll have D4. And now basically this goes through, and you can see that it tries to rebuild everything, but if it can't, it basically tells you that there's an error. Okay, let's go back, correct my code, go back here, detected change, it's going to go ahead and rebuild. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to come back here, and this little developer visual has a reload command. There's also a toggle auto reload. If I click on that right there, let's go back here and we'll make one more quick change. So here we'll say hello Tampa, where I am today, and we'll go ahead, and now you can see it's rebuilding my project. And now I go back here, and auto reload basically says if you detect a change, don't make me reload it. Okay. Now, let's go ahead and move over to one more project. let's say that I'm done with this particular project. So basically there's a little web server up and running that's serving things up, and this particular developer visual knows how to go to the local machine and port 8080 to basically get the files for that particular web part. And in short, that is our development environment. If I want to stop this, I'm going to press Control-C, and Control-C allows me to terminate that batch job. Great. Okay, now I'm going to move over to a different project, and this project right here is the simple bar chart. Now that I have the simple bar chart, let's go ahead and start that guy up. So now we'll go ahead and start this guy up, and now once again it's listening. I'll come back over here, and so now let's go ahead and add some things inside there. So in this case we'll add sales revenue, we'll go down to customer, and we'll add something like state, or instead of state, we could add something with fewer values. Okay, so the idea is, here is a example of a custom visual. Now, if we go and take a look at what's inside here, what you're going to see is that this kind of builds on the different things that I've been talking about. So you have a visual, and the visual has an SVG file or an SVG element, and it also works with SVG groups. The idea is that you can create an SVG element and start putting different elements inside, but you can also, once you create the SVG, create an SVG group and then push things inside there, because then you could take the group and you could move it to the left or right or up or down itself. Okay, now there's also this thing which is called a data view that we're going to see. Now, when you look at this model, they don't have an init method. They have a constructor that they give you. And the idea is that your constructor gets called and they pass you this options object inside. If you look at options, what do they give me, inside of this API? And basically there is a element. So that's the main element that you're going to be writing into. And then they give you a host. And when you look at the host, there's things like what are the colors, there's things like the selection builder inside. Okay, now inside of this constructor, we're going to create an SVG object, we're going to create a group. Okay, and then most of your work happens inside the update method. Now inside of the update method, they pass you options, but here they give you a viewport. So you can determine the width and height of the container that you're working in. They have different view modes. So if you have a visual, do you want it to render differently when someone's in edit report mode than when they're in view report mode? So you can detect what viewed mode they're in. And also the data comes back to you in this thing which is called data views. Now, here's an example of the data that comes back. So let's say, as we're working with this inside here, and I've added these two different pieces of data, this categorical data, which is basically text-based data, and then there's measure data, that's numeric. So I have one of each of these things inside there. Now, first thing that we have to do is you have to define in capabilities.json, what type of data that you want to accept. So we're going to have a category and a measure. Category is generally string-based data, measure is numeric data, and I give these things both names inside here, and that's basically why these things show up the way that they do. Okay, once we have that, there's also data mappings. So one of the things I could say is once I've got a category, I don't want more than one. Once I have the measure, I only want one particular value down here. So you might see some visuals that allow you to put multiple elements inside here. But this one says maximum one, so when you put one in, it replaces the other. We also have some code, once we've kind of created this mapping, I could go to options, go to data views, and look at the categorical data. Now, here's a really neat trick. When you're back here, and we've already looked at a couple of these buttons, reload, auto reload, show data view. This one's really powerful. And the idea is you can see the exact data that's inside of your data set. So there's categorical data, And then under categories, you're going to have, some values inside there. And then also under values and values.values, you're going to see all the different values inside here. So one of the things that, I'm trying to show in this example is that you only want to render if you have the data that makes sense. But if you have, one but not the other, what are you going to do? So here's some code that basically says, well, let's get the categorical reference off the main data view. And if categories is undefined or if the values are undefined, well, then let's just go ahead and erase everything inside there. So only when you have, data that makes sense inside here, do we render. Otherwise, we just leave everything blank. Okay, now as we go down here, some examples are, I'm also creating a plot. So within the viewport, which is everything, we'll create a plot, and generally that's going to be, where the bars get drawn. And I can move the plot up or to the right if I want to fit axes inside there. As we keep going down here, what you're going to see is that you also, need to figure out how you're going to take the data from its current view. So right here, we have options, data views, categorical, and I pass that to this converter that I have. Now, if I look down here at this converter function, what you'll see is that, you have to look at your data and figure out, how to build it into something that's easy. So I've created this interface category item, which basically has a category, item, and a value. And then we basically fill it up with data and we pass it back. Okay. So the idea here is, once we have converted the data, now we have something to work with. So we'll set up a scale for both the x-axis and the y-axis. We'll then create axes. Here's something for the x-axis inside there. Note down here, you have these particular values. Just as an example here, once we've created that, let's say that we take this line of code and I gray it out, and now, well, let's see, I can't really gray that out if I use that down below. Okay, I wanted to show you the before and after. Okay, so now that looks like it worked. Here was the before picture, and you can see the numbers don't look very good inside there. So one of the tricks that you're going to have to learn, is how to, in this case, we're going to create something which is a format. And the idea here is that there's a D3 format method that creates a function, and there's different formatting codes inside there. And then down here under tick format, I can basically say, here is the function that I want to run inside there. Let's go ahead, let's save, it rebuilds. Now we'll come back here and we'll refresh. And so basically now we've got the pretty formatted inside there. So being able to deal with axes, being able to reformat the axes, gets to be an important step inside there. Okay. Now, I think at this point, I'm going to kind of let you take this sample code and see some of the other things about it. What I wanted to do is kind of keep things simple. Now, one extra piece here is that you can also add properties. So if I go back to capabilities, one of the things that you see is that I wanted to add an object, which is basically something that has one or more properties that you can show in the format properties pane. So I wanted to have bar chart colors inside here. Okay, one of the problems with that is when you're testing things inside here and you go over here, you might find that they don't show inside there. So you have to make sure that you get everything correct, to be able to make these show. But the idea is that once you have a color, for instance, I want to come down here, I want to let people, change the bars to a different color inside there. So the pieces that make that work is, first of all, by defining objects. So the object is kind of really the top level, this inside here, and then the child properties. In our case, I've created one named color, and it's based on the fill type. And once you create it on the fill type, they automatically give you a selector. But there's all kinds of different types that you can use that have different visual interface elements inside there. But once you've got that, let's go back to Visual TS one more time. And there are two pieces. One is I create this private static function called getFill. Now, if you want to see, what those values are, and we go back to the data view, and then down here, if we look inside of metadata, and then inside of columns, and then, what we're going to find somewhere, is that there is, okay, it's not columns, but it is objects, and then color selector, and fill, and that is the particular color that we have inside there. But the idea is that this piece of code knows how to look at the data view, go find the object of a specific name, pull out the fill. Okay. And so then the last piece is implementing this thing called enumerate object instances. So the idea is when your visual loads in, they call this particular method, and they call it for each one of your objects. So here's my object called color selector, and what I need to do is basically push out a value for that. So those are the pieces that make all that fit together. Okay, the last piece here is that when it's time for me and I'm all done and it's just time to ship my code, well, it's pretty easy. PBIVIZ and then simply package. We'll go ahead and we'll call package inside there, and it basically builds the PBIVIZ file for me. Okay, now if we go back here and we kind of open this thing up, it's inside the dist folder, and there it is. And someone could take that and basically start utilizing that inside there. Okay, one little tidbit here. If I go back and I kind of take a look at what we had kind of before the summer, when someone built a custom visual according to Microsoft guidelines, you would have a package.json, you'd have a resource file inside there, and this would basically be your code inside. Now, with this new tool set that they created over the summer, what you're going to find is there is a package.json file. Let's say that I open this thing inside, what's inside here? Not that much stuff, but basically just saying, I am a file, and here are things like the name of my visual inside there. But then also, there's only one file inside here. So this kind of freaked me out the first time I saw it. You go down here, and there is a single file. So all your TypeScript code has been converted to JavaScript, and other things might be in there as well. But let's go ahead and open this. And what you could see is instead of having individual files, they basically just have this pb.json file, and one of the things they have inside there is the content. So basically, they have a content property JS, and there basically is the mimified JavaScript that was emitted from your TypeScript file. Okay. So, once again, you can see that, as you start working with this, there's a whole new development environment, and I would embrace Visual Studio Code, as an alternative. Sometimes use Visual Studio, sometimes use Visual Studio Code. Last thing is, once I've created this tool set, I would recommend that you use Visual Studio Code over Visual Studio. However, that being said, for some people who are more comfortable with Visual Studio and they like the white background instead of the black background, they don't know how to switch the themes, let's go ahead and go to that last project. And if I just say open, but not project solution, but open website, this allows me to open a folder. And so if we go down here and we find one of those particular projects that I've created, my first project, let's go ahead and open that up. Visual Studio reads the TS config file, and so I can now open this up and I can start writing my code inside here and basically using node.js to do my debugging. So I can use either tool that I want. You just have to use node.js and its command line to be able to create the projects inside. Okay, so with that, I think now I have gone through all the things that I wanted to go through today. One more thing I want to now kind of just call out back to what we looked at before today. If I go back to criticalpathtraining.com and we take a look at this new course, which is Power BI Developer Bootcamp, and we go down here, we're going to run the first delivery of this next February 27th, but what you'll see is that we spend, day one just really making sure everyone's comfortable with Power BI Desktop, because so much development, whether you're building the Power BI Desktop project or not, you still need to know what's inside there. Day two, we basically look at what we just went through in this webinar, going down and dirty with TypeScript and D3 library, getting started with Power BI developer tools, and then really drilling down on how do you design custom visuals with accesses and web parts, or not web parts, but custom properties. Day three is all about the R data analytics platform. So we'll get started writing R scripts. We'll then work how to integrate R scripts into Power BI Desktop. And finally, just like you can create custom visuals entirely in TypeScript, you can create custom visuals that are R visuals that allow you to do amazing things with R and package it up into a reusable custom visual. And then the last day of the course, we look at programming with a Power BI REST API. So doing things, such as creating streaming data sets, creating real-time dashboards, embedding reports and dashboard tiles into your custom web applications. And then finally, looking at Power BI Embedded, as a great way to ship commercial applications that leverage the Power BI platform. Okay, so with that, that now is all the material I wanted to go through. We've run a little bit over, but I'd like to thank everyone for coming here. And there will be a follow-up message. We're going to try to get the recording for this out to you as soon as possible. It might be sometime next week, but we certainly appreciate you coming and listening to us for the last hour, and certainly hope that you found this information useful. Thanks very much.